It was just another typical morning. The sun was rising slowly over Charleston, casting long shadows from the ancient Spanish moss trees as Celeste Monroe stepped out of her silver Buick. Her heels clicked softly against the stone steps of the courthouse, each step resonating with quiet determination. She was composed, dressed in a navy blue blazer, with a slim leather portfolio in hand, ready for a day like any other. But what she didn't know was that this day would take a sharp turn, one that would alter the course of her life as she approached the security checkpoint. The usual mundane routine shifted. Deputy Hank Riker, standing with his arms crossed, narrowed his eyes as Celeste neared. His gaze lingered on her, judging, sizing her up. He didn't recognize her, and frankly, he didn't care to. He wasn't used to seeing someone like her walk into the courthouse with such quiet confidence. In his eyes, people like her needed to be reminded of their place. Without a word, he stepped forward, blocking her path. "Ma'am," his voice was gruff. "Step out of line." Celeste paused. "Was there a problem?" she asked calmly, her composure unshaken. Riker didn't respond immediately. His eyes swept over her, from her neat silver locks, to her pressed slacks, to the calm but confident look in her eye. Something about her bothered him. She looked like she belonged here, but in his world, people like her had no right to that kind of assurance. This wasn't just another routine security check. This wasn't a simple interaction between a citizen and a law enforcement officer. This was the start of a story that no one could have predicted. One where the roles would be reversed, and Celeste Monroe, the woman they underestimated, would become the very force that brought their world crashing down. Celeste's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her composure. Something in the air had changed the moment Riker stepped forward, his thick forearms crossing like the bars of a prison cell. He was blocking her way now, his glare cold, his posture rigid with an authority that felt more like intimidation. The weight of his eyes made her spine straighten, her calm slipping just for a moment. She had entered this courthouse many times before, but today felt different. "Ma'am," he repeated, his voice rougher now, "I'm going to need you to step out of line." The command rang through the quiet morning like a slap. It was too sharp, too sudden, and it was a red flag that burned hot through her chest. She had already shown him her credentials, but his eyes never lingered on the badge, only on her, dissecting her like she was out of place, like she didn't belong. She swallowed the rising knot in her throat. She could feel the eyes of others on her now, those around the scanner, the clerks behind the desk. They could feel the shift, the tension. She wasn't just a woman walking into a building anymore. She was the target. And that was a reality she hadn't prepared for. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady, her hands gripping the edge of her portfolio just enough to make her fingers ache. There was no need to be anything but polite. But the longer she stood there, the more she could feel the danger in the air. It was a spark ready to ignite. Riker didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned her, starting at her silver locks twisted into a neat, controlled style, then down to her pressed slacks, to the calm but knowing gaze she held. A woman who knew what she was doing, who had seen it all before. His eyes hardened. This was not the type of woman he expected. He didn't like it. He didn't like her. "You can't just waltz into a federal building looking like that," he muttered, more to himself than to her. His words were like a slap in the face, but Celeste didn't flinch. She'd been called worse. She had been dismissed by many before, had watched doors close in her face, had fought to be seen, to be heard. She had never expected a courthouse to be any different. But today was going to be different. She wasn't just walking in. She was claiming the space. With a quiet, controlled breath, Celeste reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out the silver badge that had always been a symbol of respect. She held it out for him, her fingers curling just slightly around its edges. "This is my badge," she said, her voice cold and precise. "I'm a federal judge. You don't get to question me." Riker snatched the badge from her hand, glancing at it without a second thought, before shoving it into his pocket without returning it. Her breath hitched slightly, but she held her ground, refusing to let him see her frustration. She didn't need him to acknowledge her authority. He didn't need to like her. "I'd like that returned," she said, her voice no longer calm, but firm, demanding what was rightfully hers. But Riker didn't budge. Instead, he leaned closer, blocking her view of the security scanner, his thick hands on his hips. His next words hit her like a cold gust of wind. "You in a rush to get somewhere, sweetheart?" The word felt like a blow. It was the kind of condescending remark designed to belittle, to remind her of her place. But she wasn't just anyone standing there. Celeste Monroe was a judge. She had the law on her side, and she had the strength to back it up. She wasn't about to let him make her feel small. "I need to get to a courtroom," she said through gritted teeth, her voice unwavering. "Now you're going to follow the procedure and return my credentials, or I will make a report about this." Riker's response was chilling in its dismissiveness. He waved her off with a casual flick of his hand and gave a sharp nod towards the side hallway. "Then you'll follow my procedure. Random checks. Let's go." His hand shot out, grabbing her arm with a grip so tight that Celeste almost winced. The sense of control he had, of dominance, was palpable, and she could feel the cold metal of the security room waiting for her. Her heart pounded in her chest. Every fiber of her being told her to fight, to yell, to push back. But something kept her still. She wasn't just Celeste Monroe anymore. She was a symbol of everything they tried to silence, everything they tried to keep down. She had too much at stake to let this man break her. She walked calmly, but every step felt like it took her further into enemy territory. The windowless screening room loomed ahead, its cold walls seeming to close in on her with each stride. Inside the room, there was an eerie stillness. A steel chair sat in the center of the room, a pair of clippers lying casually on a rolling cart. Celeste's stomach dropped. She couldn't breathe for a moment. This was happening. She was being treated like a criminal, and it felt like she was trapped. "I don't consent to this," she said firmly, meeting his eyes. "You have no legal cause to detain me." Riker didn't care. He was already too far gone. And as the door shut behind her, the sound of the lock clicking felt final. Her dignity, her identity, everything that had made her her, was slowly being stripped away, strand by strand. The door shut with a dull, final thud behind her. Celeste stood still for a moment, her breath shallow, the cold air of the room pressing against her skin. The fluorescent lights above buzzed, casting a stark, sterile glow over the small, windowless space. Her eyes flicked to the clippers resting on the rolling cart beside the steel chair. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her, but she fought it down, burying the anxiety that clawed at her chest. She wasn't a victim. Not today. Not now. "Sit down," Riker barked, his voice gruff, his hand still gripping her arm with an uncomfortable tightness. She didn't resist as he steered her toward the chair, but there was a fire in her that refused to be snuffed out. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't afraid of the humiliation he was trying to impose. The fear was in the small cracks of uncertainty, the places where he wanted to break her. He could not have that. Celeste slowly lowered herself into the steel chair, the cold of the metal seeping through her clothes, biting into her skin. She kept her posture straight, her back rigid, not allowing him the satisfaction of seeing her crumple. She was a judge. She had spent years working through the complexities of the law, using her intellect to dismantle every injustice she encountered. This was nothing. Her eyes never left Riker's, steady and unwavering as he moved around her. The tension in the room grew thick, palpable. He was enjoying this, the power, the control. The smell of his sweat and aftershave hung in the air, a constant reminder of his dominance. He approached her from behind, and she could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on her. "You're about to learn some respect," he muttered as he picked up the clippers. The cold metal clattered as he adjusted them, the sound cutting through the silence with an eerie finality. His next words hit her like a slap. "Should have come in here with some respect. Now you look more presentable." The word stung, but Celeste didn't flinch. She had been humiliated before. She had felt small, insignificant, overlooked by those in power, and today she could feel that familiar sting again. But this time, it wasn't the sting of defeat. It was the sting of betrayal, of injustice, of something much more dangerous. As the first strands of her silver hair fell to the floor, she closed her eyes for just a moment. She could feel the weight of history crashing down on her. Each strand that fell represented something larger. Every fight for equality, every struggle for recognition, every challenge she had faced as a woman, as a person of color, as a judge. It all fell away in those few moments. And yet, the more hair that dropped, the more she felt her power grow. She wasn't going to be broken. The clippers hummed through her locks, severing the ties to the identity she had worked so hard to build. Her silver curls, her heritage, her pride, gone in an instant. But then she heard it, the laughter, a cruel, biting sound that came from one of the guards standing in the corner of the room. His voice was thick with amusement as he muttered, "She looks better already." His words dripped with mockery, and Celeste's heart pounded in her chest. But she didn't react. Her fists clenched in her lap, her nails digging into her palms until they bled. But she didn't allow herself to make a sound. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She wouldn't let them win. Not like this. "Now you look more presentable," Riker repeated, wiping stray hairs from his sleeve, completely oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed. He thought he was in control. He thought he had stripped her of her dignity. But what he didn't know was that Celeste Monroe was not a woman to be stripped away. She opened her eyes, her gaze colder than ever, her face calm. She had taken enough. Now, it was time to make them regret every second of this. That as the clippers finished, Riker stepped back, clearly satisfied with his handiwork. His smirk was a cruel reflection of his belief that he had broken her. But Celeste wasn't broken. She wasn't going to let him see her hurt. "Are you done?" she asked quietly, her voice measured, firm, but with an edge that could cut through stone. Riker paused, as if the question had caught him off guard. He met her eyes briefly, and for the first time he seemed uncertain. Something flickered in his expression, but he quickly masked it with a gruff, "Get up, let's go." Celeste stood without hesitation. Her head held high despite the uneven patches of hair that remained. She didn't care what they saw. They didn't see her. They didn't see the woman who had fought tooth and nail for every step she had taken. They didn't see the fire in her eyes that had just been ignited. They didn't see the reckoning that was coming. She walked out of the room, her steps slow but purposeful. The humiliation of this moment wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And as she passed the two clerks in the hallway, both of them looking away quickly, she knew that today, the tide would turn. The courtroom would soon see what she was truly capable of. That as Celeste walked through the cold, sterile hallways of the courthouse, her feet barely made a sound. But with every step she took, the ground beneath her seemed to shift, as if the very air around her was holding its breath. The humiliation she had just endured, the loss of her dignity, none of it mattered now. Not anymore. What had been an oppressive weight was now a weapon. She had been brought low, but in doing so, they had unleashed something far more dangerous than they could comprehend. She was no longer just Celeste Monroe, the woman they could disregard. She was the judge, the one who held the power in this very room. And soon, they would feel her wrath. Her heels clicked sharply on the marble floor as she approached the courtroom doors. A soft murmur of voices echoed from the other side. She paused for just a moment, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The room went quiet. Celeste didn't glance at the crowd. She didn't need to. The change was immediate. People shifted in their seats, eyes widened, and the whispers died down. Her presence alone commanded attention. The deputy, Riker, was still standing by the door, his stance rigid, eyes locked on her as she walked in. But this time, he wasn't the one in control. He was no longer the one who would dictate the rules. She was as she passed the defense table. Celeste's gaze briefly flicked to the prosecutor, a woman she had worked with many times before. The prosecutor's eyes were filled with something that resembled both relief and awe. Celeste was no longer just the judge. She was something far more dangerous, a force to be reckoned with without a word. She moved toward the bench and took her seat. Her robe draped over her shoulders like armor, but it was more than that. It was the symbol of her authority, of her years spent climbing the ranks, of everything she had worked for. And now it was time to make them see just who she was. The court was silent as Celeste adjusted the robe, her fingers grazing the folds of the fabric. She had been through so much to get here, to this moment, to this very room. And now all that mattered was justice. The law was her weapon. Her voice would carry more weight than any insult, any attack. She looked directly at Riker, who had not moved a muscle. His face was pale, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly ajar. The smugness, the arrogance he had displayed just moments ago, had vanished. It was gone, replaced by fear. Fear of the woman who had just walked in and taken control of the room. As Celeste turned her attention to the case in front of her, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. She was calm, her gaze steady. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and charged. But there was something else now, something palpable, respect. It wasn't given freely, but it was earned. And in that moment, Celeste knew she had earned it. She called the next witness. Her voice was calm, precise, and yet it carried with it an unspoken power. The witness, a man who had been involved in the protest incident, took the stand, his eyes darting nervously toward Riker, who was still standing near the door, his hands twitching. Celeste noted it, but she said nothing. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch, the tension thickening the air. Riker's unease was palpable, and as he shifted his weight, trying to retreat into the background, Celeste locked eyes with him. It was a quiet confrontation, one that didn't require words. His eyes flickered with panic, and she saw the shame in them, something he had never felt before. "Deputy Riker," Celeste said, her voice cold but steady. "You have a history of complaints, formal and informal, complaints that were buried, dismissed, because people like you thought they could get away with it. You thought I was just another black woman you could push around, just another person who wouldn't be seen." The room was deathly silent. The weight of her words hung heavy, and Riker took a small step back, his face drained of color. "But I'm not just another person," Celeste continued, her gaze never leaving his. "I'm the one who will make sure you answer for every single complaint, every single injustice you've committed. Not just today, not just because of what you did to me, but because you've done this to others. For years." Riker tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. He had no excuse, no defense. His own guilt had shackled him in that moment. Celeste's eyes never wavered as she turned back to the witness on the stand. "You're here to tell the truth," she said softly, but with the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths in her words. "And your truth matters. That's all that matters in this room." The witness spoke, and as his voice filled the room, Celeste's power was undeniable. She wasn't just hearing the testimony. She was commanding the very space. The tension that had clung to the courtroom like a storm cloud was slowly dissipating. Every word, every movement she made, every shift in her posture, it was a declaration. And Riker, still frozen by the door, understood now. The game had changed. The woman he thought he could break had broken him instead. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Celeste sat still, her eyes locked on the proceedings, her mind working with precision as she pieced together the web of corruption she had uncovered. The case before her, about a police officer's brutal behavior during a peaceful protest, was not just a single wrong to be righted. It was a symbol of the deeper, festering rot within the system that had protected people like Deputy Riker for far too long. Celeste's fingers tapped gently on the desk, a subtle rhythm that seemed to echo through the silence. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her. Riker stood against the wall, now trembling with something she couldn't quite read: fear, guilt, or maybe just the dawning realization of the mountain of evidence against him. His earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by a cold sweat that beaded on his forehead. Celeste's gaze shifted from Riker to the witness in front of her, a man who had been present at the protest. His voice shook as he recounted the brutality he had witnessed, describing how an elderly man had been shoved to the ground by officers, his ribs broken under the weight of unnecessary force. The man had been unarmed, defenseless, just a peaceful protester demanding justice. And yet, in the eyes of those meant to serve and protect, he had been nothing more than a target. She listened closely, her eyes narrowing as the witness described Riker's actions. With each word, the truth began to settle in Celeste's bones like a bitter pill. The officer had never been questioned. His behavior had been dismissed. The system had turned a blind eye, repeatedly, to every complaint, every instance of abuse. She could feel it now, the simmering rage that was rising within her, threatening to overtake her carefully composed exterior. But she wasn't going to break. Not now. "Mr. Briggs," Celeste said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You've just confirmed that Deputy Riker was directly responsible for pushing an elderly man to the ground. What happened next? Was there any accountability for this violence?" The courtroom was silent as the witness shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sweat slicking his brow. He had seen it. He had lived it. And he knew the truth, but he was afraid. Afraid to speak out against the system that had allowed this to happen time and time again. "Nothing happened," the witness muttered, barely audible, his voice thick with the weight of helplessness. "No one did anything. The complaint was buried. It was all swept under the rug." Celeste's eyes flicked to Riker, whose face had gone ashen. His lips trembled, and his eyes darted toward the door, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He knew what was coming. He could feel the walls closing in. "Buried?" Celeste repeated softly, the word heavy in the air. Every single complaint. Dismissed. Ignored. She let the silence stretch out, allowing the words to sink in, to make their mark. How many other officers have done the same thing? How many more have been protected by this system of corruption? There was no answer. The room was silent, the collective weight of the question hanging over everyone like a dark cloud. Celeste leaned forward, her eyes piercing as she looked directly at the defense table. The lawyer's face had turned pale, his hand twitching at the briefcase in front of him. He wasn't prepared for this. No one was. "I've reviewed the records, Mr. Campbell," Celeste said, her voice unwavering. "And I've seen that there are 12 formal complaints against Deputy Riker. 12. And yet not a single one was pursued. Why is that?" The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing nervously at Riker. He had no answers. He knew better than to speak. This was no longer a case about a single officer's actions. This was about the system that had allowed him to continue. And now, Celeste was going to expose every single crack, every single rot, and rip it open for the world to see. "Riker wasn't the only one," Celeste continued, her voice rising with conviction. "The truth is, there are more officers like him, protected by a system that values loyalty over justice. A system that buries complaints and covers up wrongdoings instead of holding people accountable. This is the system you're defending." The defense attorney opened his mouth to speak, but Celeste held up a hand, silencing him. She wasn't finished. Not yet. She stood slowly, her robe sweeping behind her like the wings of an avenging angel. "And it's not just Riker. It's a pattern. A system-wide failure to protect the people, to uphold the law, and to treat everyone equally." She turned to the jury, her voice now a powerful force that filled the room. "What I'm asking you to do here today is not just to decide the fate of one man. I'm asking you to decide if this system is worth saving. I'm asking you to stand with me, to stand with those who have been silenced for too long." The room was still. Celeste could feel the shift in the air. The truth had been laid bare, and the weight of it pressed down on everyone. Riker was no longer just a man on trial. The entire system was, and Celeste Monroe was not about to let it escape unscathed. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath, suspended in a moment that stretched impossibly long. Celeste stood there, her back straight, her face as calm as ever, but inside, a storm raged. The evidence, the testimonies, the layers upon layers of systemic rot. All of it was falling into place. She could feel it, the way the air had shifted, the way the audience, the jury, and even the defense were all silently waiting for the inevitable unraveling. Celeste's words had landed like a hammer, but she wasn't done. She wasn't just calling out a single officer anymore. She was taking aim at the entire structure. The courtroom was no longer just a space for legal arguments. It had become the battleground for something far larger than any one case. This was about power, accountability, and justice for everyone who had been silenced. The defense attorney shifted nervously in his seat, his fingers tapping the edge of the desk in a rapid, desperate rhythm. He knew this wasn't going to go the way they had planned. Not anymore. Celeste had peeled back the curtain, revealing a machine of corruption, and now it was grinding to a halt. The momentum was on her side. The truth was on her side. And the power she had been denied for so long, the power that had been stolen from so many, was now hers to wield. Her eyes flicked to Riker, who had retreated further into the corner of the room. His hands were shaking, his back pressed against the wall, as if he hoped he could sink into it and disappear. But Celeste wasn't done with him. Not by a long shot. The witness from earlier, Mr. Briggs, had already spoken the painful truth. Riker's history of abuse was no longer a secret. 12 formal complaints, dozens of informal ones, all of them ignored, all of them buried. "Let me make this clear," Celeste's voice rang out, sharp and authoritative, cutting through the room like a sword. "This isn't about one officer. This is about every officer who has crossed that line, who has been protected because the system refuses to hold them accountable. This is about the countless complaints that were discarded, the countless voices that were silenced." There was a murmur in the audience, a collective shifting in their seats. Celeste could feel the eyes of the room on her now, every single person aware of the truth, of the damning reality that was being laid bare. She turned her gaze back to the defense attorney, whose eyes were darting nervously, struggling to form a coherent response. "You want to sit there and tell me this is an isolated incident?" Celeste's voice rose, her eyes blazing now with righteous fury. "You want to act like Riker's actions are just one mistake? A mistake that can be swept under the rug and forgotten about? No, this is part of a pattern. A pattern of abuse and disregard that has been allowed to flourish because people like him are protected by the very system meant to uphold justice." The room was silent now, the tension suffocating. Even the defense attorney seemed to recognize that there was no going back. Celeste's words had shattered the illusion of justice, exposing the system's deep flaws. She was no longer just a judge presiding over a case. She was the voice of all the victims, all the people who had been ignored, disrespected, and abused by those who swore to protect them. Celeste's gaze swept across the courtroom, landing on the faces of the jurors. She could see it now. Their eyes no longer held the same uncertainty. They were seeing it too. They understood what was at stake. She could almost feel the shift in the air, the collective weight of the truth settling on their shoulders. "The system failed," Celeste said, her voice now softer, but every word still carrying the weight of everything she had uncovered. "And it's time we change that. We can't keep allowing these officers to hide behind a shield of silence and power. We can't keep letting them harm others without facing any consequences." She took a deep breath and let it out slowly, her gaze hardening once more as she turned back to Riker. "You didn't just hurt that elderly man, Deputy Riker. You hurt all of us, and you will answer for it." Riker flinched, his eyes finally meeting hers. The realization of what was happening, what was coming, seemed to settle over him like a cold shroud. He had thought, perhaps, that his badge would protect him, that his position of power would shield him from the consequences of his actions. But Celeste had shattered that illusion. She had taken the walls he had built and torn them down one by one. Her voice rang through the courtroom again, this time with the certainty of someone who had fought this fight for far too long. "This isn't just about one officer. This is about the system that enabled his behavior. The system that allowed him to do this again and again without fear of reprisal." She turned to the jury. "This is your chance to make sure this doesn't happen again. To take a stand and say enough is enough." The silence that followed was deafening. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with understanding, with the weight of justice hanging in the air, ready to be served. Celeste leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving Riker. She had done what she needed to do. She had exposed the truth. Now it was up to them. And as the courtroom doors opened and the jurors began to deliberate, Celeste knew that something profound had shifted in that room. She had unraveled the system, and now there was no going back. The moment the jury exited the courtroom, a heavy silence enveloped the room. Celeste stood at the bench, her hands gripping the sides of her robe as if they were the only thing keeping her steady. The weight of what she had just done, the monumental shift she had orchestrated, felt both liberating and suffocating at the same time. She had exposed the cracks in the system, the corruption that ran deep, but now it was time for the reckoning. Her eyes remained fixed on the door where the jury had exited, their hushed voices carrying only fragments of conversation that she couldn't quite make out. She could feel the tension tightening in her chest. This wasn't just about Riker anymore. This was about a broader fight, one that had been simmering for years, fought by countless people who had been wronged by those in power. Now Celeste had become their voice, their ally, and the battle was far from over. She glanced across the courtroom. Her gaze landed on Riker. He was still standing, unervingly still, by the wall, his face pale, his mouth slightly agape as he tried to process everything. The arrogance, the confidence he had worn like armor earlier, was gone, replaced by something far more vulnerable. His shaking hands were clenched at his sides, his eyes darting toward the door as if hoping, praying, that someone would come to save him. But Celeste knew that the walls had already closed in. The system had failed. It had failed Riker's victims, it had failed the people who trusted it, and it had failed Celeste in more ways than she could count. But now it was time for the reckoning, for the truth to be delivered, for accountability to be exacted. She took a deep breath, gathering herself. There was no turning back now. The door creaked open, and the jury returned. They filed in, their faces a mix of solemn determination and the heavy weight of the decision they were about to make. Celeste watched them closely, her heart pounding in her chest. Each juror took their seat, their eyes flicking nervously toward Riker, who hadn't moved. And then the foreperson stood, holding the fate of not only one man, but a broken system, in their hands. We, the jury, find the defendant, Deputy Hank Riker, guilty of all charges. The foreperson's voice rang out, clear and firm. The words hit like a thunderclap. The room held its breath for just a beat before the collective tension snapped. Celeste felt a rush of relief, but it was tempered by something deeper, something harder to name. The fight for justice wasn't over. The battle had only just begun. Riker stood frozen for a moment, the reality of the verdict sinking in. His eyes met Celeste's, desperation, fear, and something else, something that bordered on shame. But she didn't flinch. She had done her part. She had exposed the truth. Now the law would do its job. Celeste stood tall as the judge called for order in the court. Her eyes didn't leave Riker. She was done being afraid. She had spent too long silenced, too long diminished by a system that didn't care. But now she was the one in control. Now the truth had a place in the light. The sentencing phase began, and Celeste listened carefully as the prosecutor laid out the case for the maximum penalty. Riker had abused his power, violated the trust of the public, and caused irreparable harm. His actions had not been a one-time mistake. They were a part of a pattern, a systemic failure to hold those in power accountable. Celeste's gaze never wavered from Riker, who was now sitting, hands clasped in front of him, his once proud demeanor shattered. He was no longer the officer who walked into a courthouse with the assumption that his badge protected him. Now he was just another man who had been caught, just another man who would face the consequences of his actions. When it was her turn to speak, Celeste rose slowly, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "Deputy Riker," she began, her eyes never leaving his. "You stood here thinking you were above the law. You thought that your badge, your position, could shield you from accountability. But today the truth has won. Today you stand before this court as a man who will answer for his crimes." The room was silent as she paused, the weight of her words settling in. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the magnitude of what she was about to say. "You may have worn that badge, but it never made you untouchable." The law is not a shield for abuse. It is a weapon for justice. And you will be held accountable. Riker's eyes flickered with something akin to fear now, but Celeste didn't look away. She couldn't. This wasn't just about his punishment. This was about sending a message to the world that justice could still be had, that the system could be held accountable. The judge called for the sentence, and the room exhaled as Riker was handed the maximum penalty. 6 years for abuse of power, 5 for civil rights violations, and another year for obstruction. But Celeste knew that the fight didn't end with this verdict. The system was still broken. Too many were still suffering. Too many were still silenced. As Riker was escorted out of the courtroom, Celeste took a deep breath. She hadn't just fought for justice. She had fought for the people who had been silenced for too long. And as she looked around the courtroom, she realized that the work was only beginning. There would be more battles to fight, more voices to amplify, more wrongs to right. But today, the fight had been won. The courtroom doors closed with a soft click, but the air remained thick with tension. Celeste stood by the bench, her hands resting on its surface as she stared at the empty space in front of her. The verdict was rendered, the punishment delivered, but something in the room felt different. The weight of what had happened, the way the system had finally been held accountable, hung in the air like electricity before a storm. She was no longer just Celeste Monroe, the judge. She was a symbol, a force for change, a voice that could no longer be ignored. But as the noise of the departing crowd faded, replaced by the hum of everyday life, Celeste found herself standing alone in the silence of the courtroom. The truth had been exposed. Riker was behind bars, his career and freedom shattered. But as she stood there, the truth was starting to settle in. This was only the beginning. Outside the courtroom, the media had already begun to swarm. News outlets were covering the case from every angle, broadcasting Celeste's victory to the world. Her name, once something known only within the walls of the courtroom, was now on the lips of everyone. She had become a symbol of something larger, a beacon of hope in a broken system. But that wasn't what moved Celeste. It wasn't the cameras, the headlines, or the praise. It was the people. The faces of those who had been waiting for someone to stand up, to speak the truth, to demand justice. Her victory was their victory. It was their voices that had been heard, their pain that had been validated. She left the courthouse, the weight of the world on her shoulders, but a glimmer of hope in her heart. The sky above was streaked with shades of orange and pink as the sun set, casting a soft glow over the city. People were still gathering outside, whispers of her triumph spreading among the crowd like wildfire. A man, perhaps in his 50s, approached her cautiously. His face was worn, tired, but there was a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He reached out, his hand trembling as he placed it on her arm. "You did it," he said softly. "You gave us a voice. You gave us hope." Celeste looked at him, her heart aching for the pain he must have endured. For too long, people like him had been unheard. For too long, they had been ignored. But now they were seen. They had been seen by the one person who refused to stay silent. A young woman, no older than 20, approached next. She looked at Celeste with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. "Thank you for fighting for us," she whispered. "You don't know what this means." Celeste nodded, her throat tight. She had fought for justice, for accountability, but it was these moments, these quiet exchanges with people who had felt the weight of the system, that made it all worthwhile. This was what she had worked for. This was what made the battle worth every single step. As Celeste continued to walk, her steps growing heavier with the weight of recognition, she could feel the eyes of the city on her. But the attention wasn't just about her. It was about what she represented. She wasn't just a judge anymore. She was a symbol of hope, of change, of the belief that one person could make a difference. The recognition was coming from the media, from the public, from the government. Her phone rang, emails flooded in, and calls were made. But the real recognition came from the people who had stood by her, who had fought with her, and who had seen the truth for what it was. That night, as Celeste sat quietly in her apartment, her eyes gazing out at the city lights, she reflected on everything she had fought for. Riker's conviction was a victory, But it was more than that. It was the beginning of a movement, the beginning of a reckoning that couldn't be ignored. The phone rang again, its sharp tone cutting through the quiet of her thoughts. She answered without hesitation. Judge Monroe. A voice on the other end said, calm and formal, "We'd like to inform you that you've been selected to receive the Presidential Medal of Justice. The ceremony will be held next month." Celeste's breath caught in her throat. She sat in stunned silence, the weight of the moment settling over her like a heavy blanket. This was the recognition she had never sought, but perhaps it was the one she needed most. Not for her, but for everyone who had been wronged, for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who needed to see that justice was possible. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in her thoughts. But when she finally hung up the phone, there was no uncertainty, only a clear, unwavering certainty that her fight had only just begun. The journey had taken a toll on her, emotionally, physically, and mentally, but the world had shifted, and Celeste had been at the center of it. She had fought for justice and accountability, and in doing so, she had inspired a nation to believe in the power of truth, the power of one person to make a difference as the night wore on. The light outside faded into the darkness, but Celeste knew, deep in her bones, that the change she had set into motion would not fade away. It would continue, grow, and ripple outward until the system that had once protected people like Riker would be no more. She had lit the spark, and it was only the beginning. The day had arrived. Celeste Monroe stood in front of a mirror, the reflection staring back at her, one she barely recognized. The woman who had walked into that courthouse months ago with only her badge and unwavering conviction was now standing on the precipice of something far greater. The Presidential Medal of Justice was not just a recognition of her actions. It was a symbol of the change she had ignited. The eyes of the nation were on her now, and as she adjusted her robe, she couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. Her phone buzzed, breaking her moment of reflection. A message from her clerk, Megan, flashed on the screen. "We're all so proud of you. You've done more than change the law, you've changed lives. I'll be there, cheering you on." A smile tugged at Celeste's lips. She thought of Megan and the countless others who had supported her through this journey, those who had believed in her before the world did. They had seen the truth. They had known this moment was possible long before it became a reality. As Celeste arrived at the venue, the air outside was charged with anticipation. A subtle hum of excitement rippling through the crowd gathered in front of the grand building. The press was everywhere. Photographers snapping pictures, reporters murmuring into their microphones, and onlookers standing at a distance, watching history unfold. It was surreal, almost like she was stepping into someone else's life. The entire world had watched as she fought for justice, but today was about more than just the battle she had won. It was about the hope she had given, the light she had shone on the darkness that had hidden for far too long. Inside, the atmosphere was opulent and formal, the weight of the occasion pressing down on her with each step she took. The ceremony had begun, and Celeste could feel the eyes of dignitaries, lawmakers, and the press all upon her. She had been called here for more than just the decision to convict one officer. She was here for the ripple effect she had caused, for showing the world that justice was possible, that truth would always find its way to the surface. The ceremony moved slowly, speeches filled with praise for Celeste's courage, her strength, her unwavering belief in the law. But as she stood there, listening to the accolades, her mind kept drifting back to the faces she had seen, the faces of the victims, the people whose voices had finally been heard. That was the real reason she was here, not for the medal or the recognition, but for them. When her name was finally called, the room seemed to go still. The applause was thunderous, but Celeste's focus remained singular, on the moment when she would finally take the stage, when she would stand before the President of the United States and receive the honor she hadn't sought but had earned with every ounce of her being. As she walked toward the podium, her heart beat in time with the applause. The golden medal gleamed under the lights, its weight heavier than she had imagined. She could feel it, the significance, the responsibility, the promise of a better future for those who had been oppressed, for those who had been forgotten. The president smiled warmly at her as she reached the podium. "Judge Monroe," he began, his voice carrying across the room, "your courage and integrity have set a new standard for justice in this country. You have not only redefined what it means to serve, but you have shown us all what true leadership looks like." The room erupted in applause, and Celeste felt the full force of the moment hit her. Her hands shook slightly as the president placed the medal around her neck, a symbol of the immense responsibility she now carried. The weight wasn't just of the medal, it was of everything that had brought her here. It was of every life that had been changed, every person who had been affected by her decision to fight back against a corrupt system. As she stood there, accepting the applause, she realized something profound. This wasn't the end. This was just another beginning. The award wasn't a conclusion to her fight for justice. It was a stepping stone, a platform that could amplify the message of accountability and change. And then, as the ceremony concluded, Celeste stepped down from the stage, her heart full, but her mind already turning to the next fight, the next case, the next injustice, the next person whose voice needed to be heard. Outside, the crowd had gathered again, this time with a different kind of energy. People waved signs, shouted cheers of support, and clapped as she made her way out. Celeste smiled at them, but inside, there was no victory dance. There was only the steady resolve to continue. "You've done more than change the law," Megan's message echoed in her mind. "You've changed lives." Celeste's steps grew steadier, her heart more resolute. This was her moment, yes, but the real victory would be in the change that continued to unfold, in the lives she could still impact, in the system she had begun to rewrite piece by piece. The world was watching, and Celeste Monroe was ready. As Celeste Monroe stepped out of the spotlight and into her new life, her legacy began to take shape, not just as a judge, but as a catalyst for something much bigger than herself. Her victory in the courtroom was more than just a single triumph. It was a rallying cry for justice, a beacon of hope for those whose voices had been silenced for too long. Her story, now told and retold across media outlets, was not just one of personal achievement, but of the deep systemic change she had set in motion. Her actions had shown the world that one person, armed with integrity and a relentless pursuit of justice, could change the course of history. Celeste didn't just fight for what was right in the moment. She fought for a future where everyone, regardless of their background, would be treated equally under the law. She proved that true leadership is not about wielding power, it's about using power for good. Her courtroom decision had set off a chain of reactions, stirring conversations nationwide about accountability, the abuse of power, and how systems that protect the few can be dismantled for the many. Celeste had cracked open a door that had been closed for far too long, and the people on the other side were beginning to step through. In the weeks that followed her recognition, there was an undeniable shift, a movement gaining momentum. Lawmakers, activists, and community leaders were joining forces to push for changes in how complaints were handled, how officers were held accountable, and how systemic injustice could no longer be swept under the rug. Celeste's work had only begun. With every law passed, every policy rewritten, every case that followed, she was creating a world where the abuse of power would no longer go unchecked. She was laying the groundwork for a future where justice was not an abstract ideal, but a tangible reality. The most profound impact of her legacy, however, would be felt by those who had once felt invisible. The victims, the voiceless, the marginalized. Celeste had shown them that they mattered. She had given them hope. Her decision to expose Riker's actions, to demand accountability for not just him but the entire system, sent a powerful message to those who had been silenced for years. You are seen. Your pain is valid. Your voice matters. But perhaps the most important lesson Celeste's journey imparted was that real change doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow, deliberate process that requires perseverance, courage, and a deep belief in the possibility of a better future. The fight for justice isn't easy, and it's not without setbacks. But Celeste's story reminds us that it is worth it. Every battle, every struggle is part of a larger movement, a movement that can eventually transform entire systems and reshape societies. This is the legacy Celeste leaves behind. It's not just in the laws she helped change or the justice she delivered. It's in the hearts of every person who saw her and thought, if she can do this, so can I. Her legacy is in the people who now know they can fight back, that the system does not have to be their oppressor but their protector. It's in the communities now empowered to hold those in power accountable. It's in the future generations who will never know the same kind of fear, because they will grow up in a world where justice truly has no bounds. Celeste Monroe's impact will be felt for decades to come. She has inspired countless others to stand up, to speak out, and to make their voices heard. And as her story continues to unfold, we are reminded of the strength of the human spirit and the importance of fighting for what's right, even when the odds are against you. If you found inspiration in Celeste's journey, if her story moved you, and if you want to see more content like this, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. Together, we can continue to learn, grow, and work towards a more just world. Let's honor her legacy by standing up for what's right every day. And remember, change starts with us. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Subscribe and let's continue making a difference.